Today, we are learning about interactions that happen in an ecosystem. Interactions between living things happen all the time in ecosystems. There are all different types of interactions that happen, whether it's between plants, animals, fungi, or more specifically, insects, or birds, or fish, or all the different living things have different interactions with each other and for different reasons. The interactions in an ecosystem can be divided into three main categories. There's competition, predation, and symbiosis. The first two are competition and predation. Competition is probably the one that you are the most familiar with. This is the struggle between organisms to survive. The whole reason why organisms would need to struggle between each other is because resources are always going to be limited. Whether those resources are food, water, maybe space, maybe sunlight, whatever it may be, organisms need to compete for resources in the ecosystem. So they struggle to survive because only so much of the resources can go to each organism. An example of competition happening in an ecosystem would be the competition of plants for space or sun, right? You have a forest, possibly, is a good example of this, where you have tall plants like trees and short plants like bushes or shrubs that are competing for space, but also sunlight. So that is a resource that's needed by the plants that they are competing for. Another example of competition is a very obvious one, and that would be animals for their sources of food. There is only limited amount of food in an ecosystem or habitat that is able to be used and eaten, so animals compete for it. Another interaction between organisms in an ecosystem is predation. This is when one organism eats another organism as their source of food. The organism that does the killing or the eating is called the predator, and the organism that is being eaten is called the prey. One thing to know that some people forget about is that prey can not only be animals, but prey can also be plants. So, a good example of this is when cows eat grass. Technically, this does not seem like predation because it is not the typical example of an animal running after another animal and catching it and killing it for food. But in reality, cows eating grass is predation because the cows would be the predator and the grass would be the prey. Now, a fox eating a rabbit is another example of predation, which is more classic and one that you might think of naturally when you think of predation. The last type of interaction is called symbiosis. And symbiosis is when an interaction happens between two organisms that live close together. And in all of these symbiotic relationships or interactions that we will talk about, at least one species will benefit from the interaction. The first type of symbiotic interaction is called mutualism. Mutualism is when both organisms benefit from the interaction. A good example of this would be clownfish and sea anemones. Clownfish have a home in sea anemones, and sea anemones get a benefit from the clownfish by removing different chemicals and giving them protection from other organisms. Parasitism is another symbiotic interaction. And this is when one species lives in, on, or inside, or really lives off of, using the resources of one, another organism, right? And so species being lived in or on or inside of are called the host. We've talked about a host before when we talked about viruses. This is a little bit different than viruses. Viruses are not living things. What this symbiotic interaction is talking about is two living things, right? And in this case, when you have parasitism, that means that one species is benefiting, one organism is benefiting, and the other one is being harmed in some way. So, a good example of this would be lice and humans. Lice usually like to live on the scalps of humans, right? And this hurts humans through their biting and their using of their resources on their body. And lice are benefited from that because they are gaining those resources. The other third type of symbiotic interaction is commensalism. Commensalism is a little bit unique because, again, like all the symbiotic interactions, one organism is benefiting or being helped, but the other organism is just kind of chilling, right? It's neither helped nor harmed, and it's just kind of there. It's just kind of present, right? A really good simple example of this would be a tree and a bird, right? Any type of bird that makes a nest in a tree would be a good example of commensalism because the bird is benefiting from having a place to put their nest, but the tree is just there, right? It's not being hurt, it's not being harmed, it's just there and providing for the bird. So that would be commensalism. Mutualism is when both organisms benefit. Parasitism is when one species benefits and the other one is harmed. And commensalism is when one species benefits and the other one is neither helped nor harmed.